My name is Damon Ferriolo. I will be your host for this video that is comprised of several sequences. I will take you from start to finish on the complete assembly of a Yamaha 1200cc VMAX engine, while making the assumption all required machining such as valve grinding, cylinder work, etc. has already been complete. The intention of this video is to act as a reference that you may even find entertaining at times. I will demonstrate processes and techniques that I use while building this type of an engine. You may find some of these processes and techniques beneficial. You may disagree with them. We all know there's more than one way to skin a cat. So without further delay, let me say welcome and let's get started. What we have here is a typical inexpensive engine stand that can be purchased at your local auto store, whatever, that's been converted to adapt to handle a VMAX engine. The couple of items to convert it was a couple pieces of bar stock, just drilled at each end, 1/2 inch hole here, 3/4 inch hole here, same thing there, piece of 3/4 inch threaded rod, and a couple of washers, jam nuts, and ready to go. Where this will become useful is when you're going to need the ability to rotate the engine as you assemble it. So as you can see, this is going to allow you to rotate it, and again, it's just another inexpensive way to try to accommodate doing a project like this at home. We're going to take the lower block, which is just the lower half of a VMAX engine, slide it on, and go through a little bit of initial prep before we start any of the component assembly. So again, just slide it on. Use these nuts as safety nuts. I don't really tighten them up too much because you're going to find you're going to want to adjust in and out as the engine gets heavier or you're doing other things. So, lower 1200cc VMAX block. Couple of things you want to make sure of before we get started. Your sealing surfaces are clean. Your bearing journals are clean. One dowel pin. Don't ask me why Yamaha only uses one in the base, but that's all they use. One dowel pin, don't look for the other one. An orifice and another oil orifice. These are used to restrict oil to the counterbalance shaft. On the bottom side, this is a good opportunity. We're going to roll this over. This is a good opportunity for you to make sure your second drain plug is in. A lot of people aren't aware of that. That's a drain plug for one cavity of the middle gear. And install yourself a new shifter shaft seal. In addition to that, this gives you an opportunity to go ahead and put in a new oil sight glass window, if that's your preference. If you got one that's clouded up or it's been cracked or whatever, knock it out from the inside. The old one will get destroyed when you knock it out. Put the new one in just like you would a seal. Next step in the process will be to install the oil pump intermediate gear train. This gear train, it drives the oil pump from the flywheel. From the clutch basket. So what we have here is a gear that mates with the clutch basket. One side's flush, one side's recessed. Pay attention to that. Your shaft and a steel gear. Steel gear to the inside of the block or left-hand side. We're going to be working from the clutch side out. Highly recommend you go with brand new retaining clips because in the process of removal, somebody may have overstretched the clip, etc. And this is one thing you don't want to come apart while your engine's running at high speeds. Also have here is a pair of bent tipped pliers, clip pliers, and I suggest you get bent and straight. For this application, I'm going to use bent. So the first thing I'm going to do is try to load this once I get into some light here. We're going to walk over, slip the shaft in right there. I'm going to load on my, leaving room to load on the steel gear. Again, the steel gear goes to the inside. Both sides are flush, doesn't matter which way you rotate it, as long as you get it in there. Now this is the fun part. Trying to get this in without overstretching the clip. So I'm going to gently open this clip. Slide it on the shaft, and now I'm going to confirm that it's in the groove by spinning the shaft. And the shaft does spin, and I don't want to leave the gap at the point of the flat. This side here, again, you want to make sure this retaining groove is to the right side or clutch side. You'll see where that comes into play later on. Flush side of the plastic gear, line up with the half, and that's it right there. Now we're going to load another clip, and I'll be right over there. Again, I prefer to use the 90 degree, gives me a little more access. Okay, the clip is on. Again, I'm going to just try to rotate it. Make sure I'm away from the flat and it's fully seated in the groove. Next step in the process that I use will be to install the shift drum, the shifting forks and shafts, the retainer plate, and the shift drum detent cam. So, again, as we spoke earlier, and we talked about having a lower block prep, a couple items I missed, is this stud here. This stud is removable and it has a locking retainer on it. This stud is used to toggle the shifter shaft. You'll see how that comes into play later. The other stud that's removable, this is a pressed in stud. This is used to retain the top half of the spring for this shift cam detent unit. So, a couple items we missed. Thirdly, we talked about assembling this shaft. As step one, actually assemble half the shaft. We're going to end up removing this gear later. As you'll find, there's a thrust retainer plate for the main input shaft of the transmission that we have to install, and that's going to be in our way. Nothing like doing it a couple of times. Everybody has that happen. Okay, shift drum. Typical shift drum. We're looking at the neutral plunger here. This is what makes contact to give you your neutral light. You want to check your cam followers, make sure there's no excessive wear, no chips, no sharp edge, no notches out of them. This shift drum looks to be in really good shape, so I'm going to go ahead and use it. Everything functions well. The star wheel, as you can see, is in good shape also. So all these parts are prepped with a engine assembly lubricant. I don't know if the camera will pick it up or not, but I've put lubricant in all the cam followers and on the bearing surface here, along with the shafts and the forks, etc. So this is pretty easy to install. Put it in, spin it around, not a big deal. Next, if you come over here, next thing to happen is we're going to install the shifting fork shafts and the forks. These forks are labeled 1, 2, 3. Very important that you keep track of that. You're going to find that that plays a big part in what we're going to be doing next. Again, on the forks, you're looking to see, are they bent? Is the nitrate, I believe this is a nitrate coating, see if they're wore off. These all look to be in pretty good shape, so I'm going to go ahead and use them. Don't see any abnormal wear here whatsoever. Now, as we talk about installing the shift drum forks, we're going to reference the engine from the left side to the right side, just as if the engine was in the bike and you were sitting in the rider's position, left to right. That's where these numbers are going to play a part. Both shafts are identical. Don't worry about mixing them up. So I'm going to go with the lower set of shafts first. Just install the shaft in this hole here. I got number 3. Number 3, because that's the last one to go in. I'm just going to lay it in there. Push the shaft through. It's a little gummy. Again, it's because of the material I'm using as a pre-lubricant. Now I'm going to go shaft 1, because I'm going to go 1, 2, 3. Lower shaft takes both forks. The upper shaft only takes one. I'm going to try to line this up with the farthest cam follower guide. And again, I'm just walking that shaft all the way in. Said and done, the shaft should be flush with the housing. And we might even rotate this a little bit. Well, I bet it would work a whole lot better if I had it in position. There we go. There. As you can see, the dogs on the forks are in their respected cam followers. We got cam follower 1, 2, and 3. Shafts in, shafts fully seated. Next, we're going to put in number 2, because again, going from left to right, the numbers are facing the left. And the left is 1, 2, and 3. There's a similar bore point. I want this one to line up with the center. And I double check myself here. See? Number facing left. So, there we go. Just as simple as that. So I don't know if you want to walk around here and give you a better perspective of how the forks are seated into the shift drum. Now that the shafts are in place, the forks are in place, we'll double check ourselves again looking at the numbers. I can see a number 1, I can see a number 2, I can see a number 3 from the left side of the engine. That's critical. You don't want to find out later that you screwed that up. A lot of work to go back. The shift drum retaining plate uses 3 Phillips fasteners. I've prepped all these fasteners with a red Loctite as specified from the manual. Red Loctite is a non-serviceable Loctite. So we're going to go ahead and sneak this guy in here, somewhat line it up with the bolt holes. I'm going to start out with a regular Phillips just to get everything started here. And you can see this plate is going to act as a retainer for both shafts. Make sure everything's in position, slightly snug. And one more to put in. I'm fully seated. I'm happy with what I see, so I'm going to go ahead and snug them a little more. And then we're going to use a Phillips impact driver on them. Not going to pay too much attention to order of sequence here. Just going to go clockwise, snug, snug, and one more time. We're going to come back to the first one. Maintain clockwise position on the impact driver. And you can feel the head of the bolt still moving. Don't want to go too far. They're 6mm. Can shear them. But it's something you don't want to come loose later. There you have it. Now, we're going to go ahead and put in the shift drum detent cam. Simple little apparatus. Pay attention to the spring. Spring hooks from right to left, and for the top, it's going to hook from rear to front around that stud we talked about. The fastener is also prepped with red Loctite, but also has a shoulder on it. Shoulder becomes critical, as you'll see it how it needs to be to function properly. So, just going to sneak this thing in here. Make sure I'm hooked on that stud. Put the cam, the detent cam wheel, right on the shift drum. Got it halfway in position, and it fell out again, no big deal. Just enough to get me started here. You want to make sure it's in position so that it properly seats on the shoulder. So, here I go. I'm flush. And now I want to relax that spring a little bit. So that I seat on the shoulder. And this shouldn't take any effort at all until you bottom out on the shoulder. So before I torque it, make sure I'm there. Things are functioning. The detent cam's working. 6mm bolt, 10 Newton meters, or 7.2 foot-pounds. I'm using a click wrench. I don't know if you can hear that, but I'm there. And again, red Loctite. We're going to install transmission input shaft. Input shaft is basically as it's described. This is the side driven, the first shaft of the transmission, driven by the clutch basket. We also have an oil gland here and a thrust retainer clip. Show you how that works, and we'll go from there. Pretty simple stuff. We're just going to pick up the whole thing. You want to pay attention This bearing can slide off, and your gears, on this particular one, the gear's under a clip. But when we get to the next shaft, you'll see why. Also, these bearings have a pin in them. You want those pins, for the moment, face straight up to help with your installation. So here we go. I positioned the shift drum into the first gear position because I find that seems to be the one that poises the forks while they're still loose to the position I need to be able to install the transmission. So I'm just going to sneak this right over fork number 1, and I may have to slide the gear around a little bit. Oh, it's already giving me trouble. We're going to slide it a little bit more. And you got a thrust washer, which is thrust plate, which is part of this bearing for this input shaft bearing. There you go. It's on the fork. Everything's happy. Next, I told you to pay attention to these little detents, pins on these bearings. There's a pocket for that pin for this bearing here. There's a pocket for this bearing opposite here. So what we want to do is roll that bearing around and then seat that pin into that pocket. There you go. We're going to do the same thing here. We're just going to spin this bearing around, take that pocket, there you go, it's tucked away. Everything's in position, everything's rolling nice. Another item is this retaining clip. It's a thrust retaining clip to maintain alignment on this rear bearing. As you can see, there's some intended play in that bearing until you install this clip. Now that clip is installed on the groove of the bearing and the groove in the block, and I'm going to rotate it to where it's halfway around. You can go either side. I'm left-handed, I go that way. No big deal. Last thing. This is the oil gland. I'm going to call it an oil gland or an oil gland circuit to help lubricate the push rod for the clutch. Now this is something that is commonly installed backwards. You'll hear of guys, I've got an engine oil leak, it's coming out, the engine oil, the leak's coming out around my clutch slave cylinder, etc. That's because this can be installed backwards. You got a pin in it, there's a pin in the lower block, pin hole in the lower block. You also have a port to pass oil in and pass oil out to continue into the circuit, which is part of the upper. But proper installation, again, left side of the engine to the right side. The O-ring is to face the right side. You can install it this way, which will not leave you enough room, shoulder room in here, to install your push rod shaft seal properly. It still functions, just going to leak, kind of like a Harley. So, just find that little pinhole, set it down in there, make sure you're seated. I already have installed a new O-ring on that. Don't be cheap, this is the time to do it. We're going to go ahead and install the second shaft of the transmission, or the output driven side of the transmission. As we talked earlier, as we were doing the input shaft, I told you to pay attention to these two bearings here. Same thing on this one. You've got a pin here and a pin here, which will play a part later. This side has no clip on it. So when you go to pick this up, you better make sure you hold on to the end of the shaft or everything's going to fall off. Another thing, don't know if the camera can pick this up or not. We have what's in here is a shim. It's already installed. This is a factory installed shim. Nothing's been done to this transmission. It's in good shape. So I'm going to go ahead and stick with the factory shim pack here. Got to pay attention to that as you're installing, because you can damage these shim packs if you're not careful, and we'll go over that. Going back to the engine block, we have our input shaft installed. Everything's ready. I'm still got the shift drum rotated to the first gear position. Again, this is to poise these set of forks while I'm installing this secondary shaft or driven shaft. So as I talked about, I'm going to pick it up with being aware that the end could slip off on me. I'm faced straight up on both pins on the two bearings. The third bearing has no pins. Don't worry about it. Then we just got to try to find a nice easy spot here, and she falls right in. And you can see I wasn't paying attention as we talked about that shim pack. So we're going to do it again. Shim pack's in the cavity properly. This is almost where it needs to be. And I'm going to Wiggle it a little bit here. And there we go. Now I've got the shim pack proper. Both my pins are facing up to where I can get at them. My shim's seated properly. And I'll show you how this works for end play. And we'll go from there. I'm on my forks. So, going back to our tools, screwdriver. I want to rotate this pin to this cavity. Sometimes you gotta pick up on the shaft just a little bit to get the weight off the outer race of the bearing. And we're just gonna tuck it in there. And I've got this pin. It goes opposite. It's going this way. So again, I'm just gonna try to rotate it. Got the weight of the shaft assembly on it. And tuck it in its cavity. So that's 4 pins you got to keep track of. This one in a cavity, this one in a cavity. Input shaft, this one in a cavity, this one in a cavity. This gland has a pin on the bottom. It's facing at 6 o'clock or straight down. That needs to be in there. Now I'm going to show you what we were talking about as far as play, end play. I'm going to intentionally push this shaft out to relax this shim pack. So now I know my shim, I can rotate it. Sometimes there's 1, 2, 3, depending on what stack up they chose to install. You want to make sure that's in there, not wrinkled, not damaged. So next, we're going to go over here to this front bearing. I'm just going to line it up a little bit with that groove. And I'm going to start this retainer, or call it a thrust retainer, where it's got to mate, everything's got to line up with the block and rotate it in. And then again, so I've got a half thrust retainer clip here, facing straight up. This is a full one. It's part of the bearing. It's dropped right in. A half retainer clip here. Rolled 50% into the block, 50% into the, which will be the upper block. So we're now installed. I'm going to apply pressure, only pressure at the moment, to push this shaft all the way against its shim pack. I'm tight in the shim pack. Just want to take a look. If it's shimmed properly, we're in the first gear position. First gear drive, first gear driven. Looks like I got good alignment there. Some of my stationary gears look to be in good alignment. So I'm satisfied with that shim pack. Next thing I'm going to do, going back to those fork pocket, shifting fork journals, I'm just going to give a little squirt of some assembly lube in here, if I can get it to come out. How about if I open the cap? That always helps. So, just putting a little bit in there. I got a fork pocket over here. I'm going to put a little bit in here. I'm going to put a little bit in here. Purpose again, keep everything wet for when the engine first starts up. And you can see, here we go. Install the shifter shaft. Just as simple as it looks, that's all it is. That's all it's going to take. I also have a extra old used shift lever from a different type model bike, Yamaha, but it fits the shaft well and it's good for testing purposes. This shaft, again, has been pre-lubricated for the purpose of making sure that when the shaft's being installed, we don't tear up that new seal, that shaft seal we put in, and gives a little bit more pre-lubrication until the engine oil starts really circulating after everything's running. So we'll let that set a minute. We're going to come over here. We talked in one of the earlier sessions regarding the studs. We got the small stud, which is a retainer for the spring. We got the larger stud. This is where the larger stud comes into play. Also, I had the shift drum in first gear for purpose of installing the input and output shafts. For the shifter shaft, I'm going to go to neutral. So that's it, right there. You see, we'll go back. There's first gear, a half cut, second gear, third gear, fourth, fifth, and that's the entire cycle of the drum. So I'm going to bring it back, half click. I'm verified I'm in neutral, and another way to do it, hold back on the output shaft, spin the input shaft, and I'm in neutral. So, it's as simple as that. No tools are really required. Just going to take the shifter shaft, install it into this bore here. There's no bearing required. The block is bored as a bushing for this function. And you'll feel it penetrate the new shaft seal. And you just want to make sure you go nice and easy, don't tear nothing up. As I get closer to that stud, as you can see, I'm going to land these two spring tails on both sides of that stud. And I'm also going to just open up the ratchet mechanism and continue to slide it in. All said and done, this should be the center of these two springs, into the shaft flush with the clutch flange, and I'm landed onto the shifter drum. Go over and grab my little lever here. Just going to slip it on, and again, this is for test purposes only. Just slide it on. We know we're in neutral, as we verified. One down, and sometimes you got to roll these things around. And as you can see, fork number 3 engaged into the driven gear of first gear. First gear on the input shaft is stationary and solid with the shaft. It's actually machined with the shaft. There's our first gear. Half click back, neutral. We'll go on to second gear. Now I'm second. I've engaged this dog off the spline into the second gear, which now becomes part of the drivetrain. And this is so on, continues on in different sequences for all the different gear patterns. There's third, there's fourth, and there's fifth. And everything seems to be functioning well. Prepare the upper block. There's only a couple of components that have to go in the block before you can start installing your bearings and marriage the upper and lower block. So what we got is a timing chain dampener bracket. It's associated bolt. There's a small little oil circuit pipe. 2 brand new copper gaskets, and a typical banjo bolt. You don't want to cheat on those either. These are brand new. Always put in brand new ones. So what we're going to do is come over here and take a look at the block. Again, just like in the lower block, this is the upper block upside down. You want to make sure all your surfaces are clean. There's not a whole lot to look for. One oil orifice here, which restricts oil to the circuit, which is going to go for that piping we just talked about. And that delivers oil to the last output bearing and recirculates back through a drain process. The other thing we're going to do is install the timing chain dampener bracket. You're probably wondering why we're only installing one when there's 2. The other one is part of the casting in the lower block, which resides opposite. And when we get back to the lower block, we'll show it to you. Bearing journals are all clean, and we'll go ahead and do this. So, I'm just going to grab this bracket, a wrench. Pretty simple to install. It's got a couple of spurs or forks on it. Can only go on one way. Just sets in there. Make sure the forks engage around the casting. The spec on this calls for 24 Newton meters. I think that's about 17 foot-pounds. I'm using red Loctite. Anything that goes inside, it calls for Loctite. It doesn't specify serviceable or non-serviceable, but I'm going with red. It's inside the engine. That's something I want to mess with. So 24 Newton meters. I'm just using a click wrench, and you can see we're there. Everything looks good. One other thing while we're here, block inspection. Obviously you're going to have your machining done wherever, whatever. Not going to get into that, but this surface here is a thrust surface, and then opposite, the surface over here is a thrust surface. This is what centers your crankshaft. You want to make sure that surface is not gouged, galled, tore up, because if it is, you got bigger issues. We're going to install one of many, and you'll see as we go later on, a little oil plumbing circuit that delivers oil to the rear output shaft bearing via through this tube. And again, you don't want to cheat and install this without brand new copper gaskets. It's a typical banjo bolt. Here's what we got. I've got my bolt, my copper, my plumbing, my copper. One thing you want to pay attention to is this silly little rubber grommet. As you can see, it's not exactly center. It's got a taper to it. You want that facing down or into the upper block. So, oh goody, I just put this together upside down. That's okay though. We're going to do a lot of things upside down. So, now I'm going to flip it over the proper way. Here we go. Again, this is the assembly. Banjo bolt, copper, plumbing, copper. They're new coppers. Looking at the end now, I got that off-center grommet. You want the long side facing to the block, the upper block, short side facing the sealing surface flange. So it's as simple as just setting it in here. I'm going to lay this rubber grommet, I'm going to start it down into that little cavity. Go over and get my wrench. By the way, this is an 8mm type banjo bolt also. Now, just as you heard me describe on this bolt, 8mm, 24 Newton meters, 17 pounds. This is 18 Newton meters, 13 foot-pounds. Reason being, it's seated in copper. If you over-torque it, you're going to crush or split, possibly split and distort the copper. You won't get the sealing surface, and you'll never know, because once it's together, it's not something you can view or see. And there we have it. There's our 18 Newton meters. And again, that seated should be slightly above the surface because the upper blocks are going to compress that so that all the oil is delivered to the bearing before it returns. Every garage should have a chalkboard. That's what we're going to use here. As you're all aware, there's the situation with how to determine the numbers, the bearing, calculating your bearing sizes. I'm going to give you my version of the described method within the manual. So let's go back here to the board. What we need to talk about are the numbers and where to find them. This set of 2 digits and this set of 4-digit numbers are located on the lower right-hand block. The first 2 numbers will represent the journals for the counterbalance shaft. Journals number 5, journals number 6. The next set of numbers will represent the journals for the main bearings. Journal 1, 2, 3, 4. Now, if you happen to be a real lucky VMAX owner, you may find that you only have 1 number and then 4 numbers engraved in your block. And these are hand engraved by the operators that assemble the engine after the measurements are done. But for most practical purposes, there's 2 numbers. I've yet to run across one with a single number, but it can happen. If it's a single number, they both equal the value of the number. Journal 5 and 6 are the same value. And again, remember, these are hand engraved. So if you're planning on painting your engine prior to assembly, that's a process I happen to use. Make sure you record these numbers before you cover them up with paint. Like I said, they're hand engraved, very, very difficult to see. We're going to try to pick it up with the camera. I doubt it. These engraved numbers all reside right on this location of the lower block, right-hand motor mount. And again, I doubt you're even going to see them. So, record them before you do any kind of finish surface on the block. Again, 2 digits, hand engraved, 4 digits, hand engraved. Journal 5 of the balancer shaft, journal 6 of the balancer shaft, journal 1, 2, 3, and 4 of the main crankshaft. Now, that's where you locate those numbers. Next, we're going to move on to the crankshaft. Crankshaft has a set of 6 digits. You'll have a digit, a space, 4 more digits. The first 2 digits represent the crank pin. This is the journal where your connecting rods go. This is also the second journal where you're connecting, the other half of the connecting rods go. We're not going to be discussing that at this time because we're only going to deal with calculating the main bearings and the counterbalance bearings. Followed by a space, journal 1, journal 2, journal 3, journal 4 of the crankshaft. And I have here the crankshaft I'll be using for this engine. Now the crankshaft numbers are located on the, we'll call it the drive side or clutch side opposite the flywheel, and these numbers are located and stamped across this area right here, and hopefully you can pick them up with the camera, and if not, not a big deal. I've got them pre-written down, and we'll move on from there. The next 2 digits we're going to talk about is the balancer shaft. The balancer shaft itself, journal number 5, journal number 6. Now these are amazingly hard to find. Again, we're going to look at your balancer shaft. Flywheel side. This is driven right off the crank. This gear here happens to drive your water pump. Counterweights to work in unison with the crankshaft. This counterweight here in this casting, there's, believe it or not, there's a number 1 and a number 4 there. The only way I can find them, I'm old. I put them under a magnifying light and I record them. But it's actually stamped 1 and 4. So the numbers on the balancer shaft are stamped, the numbers on the crank are stamped, and the numbers on the block are engraved, some of the hardest ones to read. So, I've got these pre-recorded. Let's now fill in some numbers and do some calculations. The upper block of this engine, we'll just do it like this. I'm sorry, the lower block of this engine, which has the hand engraved values on it, for journal number 5, it has a value of 6. The hand engraved number 6. For journal number 6, it has a value of 7. Remember, these are balancer shafts. Now we're going to go to the main journals of the block. On this particular block, decent looking block. For journal 1, I have a 6. For journal 2, I have a 6. Journal 3, I have a 7. Journal 4, I have a 6. Pretty good numbers. Numbers are very close. Now we're going to go to the crankshaft. I'm going to fill in the numbers for the crankshaft. This particular crankshaft, the 2 crank pins, we're going to call it pin number 1, has a value of 2. We're not going to be dealing with that at this time. It'll be later on. Pin number 2 has a value of 2. Good looking crank so far. Now, space in that stamped number, reading it from left to right, right off the crankshaft, I have a value of 1, I have a value of 3, I have a value of 3, and I have a value of 2. Moving on to the numbers we saw on the balancer shaft. So, a number 1 and a number 4. Again, these are the ones really difficult to find. Number 1 and a number 4. So now we have captured all the numbers. Next thing is, what do we do with them? Well, again, I'm going to go over this one more time. If it sounds redundant, bear with me. Balancer shaft, journal number 5, value of 6. Balancer shaft of the block, journal number 6. It's got a value of 7. Main block, journal 1 has a value of 6, journal 2 has a value of 6, journal 3 has a value of 7, journal 4 has a value of 6. Crank pin 1 is a number 2, crank pin 2 is a number 3, and again, 1, 2, 3, and 4. These are the journals of the crankshaft. Crankshaft main journal 1 is a 1, main journal 2 is a 3, main journal 3 is a 3, main journal 4 is a 2. Balancer shaft, journal 5, journal 6. Value of 1, value of 4. It's not uncommon to see this much difference in numbers. You'll see how it all plays a part. This is how, when you're facing the engravement, facing the stamping or the stamping, reading from left to right, how the respective journal numbers correspond. Now we're going to talk about the journal numbers of the block. As I told you earlier, I like to reference the block from the left side to the right side, just as if the engine was in the bike and you're in the seating position. So we're going to talk about the main crank journals. As you see, there's 4 main crank journals, going from left to right. Journal number 1, and that number 1 is going to correspond with this number 1 value. Journal number 2, left to right, journal number 2 is going to correspond with this value. Journal number 3 is going to correspond with 3, and so on. 4 with 4. Now we're going to move up to the balancer journals. Journal number 5, journal number 6. So for journal number 5, I have a value of 6. For journal number 6, I have a value of 7. So we'll take a breath, and now we're going to move on to the crankshaft. As I described the crankshaft to you, you read the numbers, but now we're going to turn the crankshaft as if it's being installed in the engine. Main journal 1, P1. This is your crank pin for your rod cylinders number 1, 2. Main journal number 2, main journal number 3, P2. Again, we're not going to be dealing with that here in this session. We'll be dealing with it later on. Journal number 4. And it's that simple. Left to right. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. We'll get ourselves the balancer shaft that's going to be used in this engine. Same thing. It's in the position as if it was in the block. Journal number 5, journal number 6. Now, hopefully you got all that, because we're going to erase it. We're going to erase part of it. Yamaha has a very simple method to derive at the calculated bearing size. I'm going to start with journal number 1 of the main bearing. Journal number 1 of the main bearing block has a value of 6. I'm going to start with the value of journal number 1 of the crankshaft. It's a 1. Now this is simple math. 6 minus 1 is 5. 5 is the number for your first main bearing. A number 5 is a yellow bearing, and you'll find the bearings are color coded and labeled with a value in the parts catalog, etc. Now we're going to go to journal number 2. So this is journal number 1 of the main. Number 2. It's a 6 also. At the block, the crankshaft's a 3. 6 minus 3, 3. Value of 3. Number 3 main is a brown bearing. Now we're going to move on to journal number 3. At the block, it's a value of 7. It's journal number 3. At the crankshaft, it's also a 3. Number 4. There's your bearing. Number 4 represents a green main bearing. Journal number 4 at the block with a value of 6. At the crankshaft with a value of 2. Subtract the 2, it's 4. So journal 1, journal 2, journal 3, journal 4. Main bearings to order is for journal 1 is a bearing size 5. Journal 2, bearing size 3. Journal 3 and 4 are bearing size 4s. Sounds simple. Do this. I suggest you practice this exercise before you order your bearings. Make sure you understand left to right. Make sure you understand what you're seeing. Now we're going to move on to the balancer shaft. Fortunately, the balancer shaft has only got 2 bearings in it. Journal number 5, journal number 6. The block with a value of 6 for number 5. The shaft is a value of 1. Subtract them to bearing size number 5. 5 on the balancer shaft is yellow. You get a yellow one. We're getting all the colors of the rainbow here. Journal number 6 is a value of 7. At the counterbalance is a 4. So there we are, 3. The other bearing for journal number 6 is a value of 3. It really is that simple. So when you order your bearings, this is the process recommended by the service manual, and this is my interpretation of it, of how to derive at the calculated bearing size. Of course, beyond that, once you get them, you're going to want to plastic gauge them and verify that all your sizing is correct, and so on. So hopefully this will wrap it up for how to derive at a bearing calculation. When we get into this piston and rod assembly to the crank, We'll also go through this exercise again for P1 and P2 and all the different rod numbers that can come up. Back to a little bench work, and the bench is still messy, but that's the way I like it. We're going to talk about the pistons, the orientation of the pistons to the block, and we'll briefly touch on the orientation of the rod to the piston, and we will get into that later as we start assembling pistons and rods, because it plays an integral part and becomes critical as to how the rod is mated to each piston. So first of all, these pistons, as you can see, a piston, a single piston, and all four of them are the same. You have an IN for intake side, EX for the exhaust valve side. Looking at it at a glance, you'd say, what's the difference? The difference is these eyebrows are cut larger for the larger intake valves. And you'll see the eyebrow actually goes all the way to the end of the piston, to the sides of the piston, where the exhaust side doesn't. So, I have, just as I would have it in the bike forward position of the bike, left-hand side of the engine, right-hand side of the engine. Intake from the rear bank, facing the center of the engine. Intake from the front bank, facing the center of the engine. You know, people describe a piston as a piston as a piston. These are just standard 1200 cc pistons, 76 millimeter. Piston has three functions. First of all, the piston has to function as a seal for your compression. Your rings expand and compress against the wall of the cylinder. That creates a seal. But the ring also seals on its flats in these grooves. It's critical these grooves are cleaned and not damaged. Because if they're damaged or not cleaned, your rings are not going to seal into the piston. So piston is a seal. Piston is a bearing. Functions as a bearing or a bushing as it's traveling through the cylinder. A piston, which would appear to be round, is not exactly round, and that's intentional. Always measure a piston from these 2 points here, perpendicular from the wrist pin journals. Reason being, that is the largest side of the piston from perpendicular to the wrist pin. At the wrist pin carries the most mass and material, so the piston grows faster this way than it does this way. So when it's done growing, it's round. When it's not at operating temperature, it's not round. That's intentional. So, as I said, it's a seal, it's a bearing. The other thing a piston is, what we just talked about, is the heat sink. Piston functions as a heat sink. So what we're going to do, so that we can begin our mating of cylinder rods, connecting rods to pistons, we're going to label the pistons, because this will become critical as we go forward. So rear left side, number 1. Rear right side, number 3. Front left side, number 2. Front right side, number 4. And that'll play a big part in how we're going to go ahead and mate each connecting rod to the piston. Function of the standard Yamaha VMAX engine, it's a full floating system. The wrist pin floats between the clips, the circlips that hold it in. There's room for growth and travel there. The width of the rod is narrow enough to where it can float inside the piston, giving you what's called a full floating effect. So you have your wrist pin floating and your connecting rod floating on your crankshaft. The reason this orientation becomes critical, and we're going to go into it in more depth as we start assembling connecting rods to pistons. Each connecting rod has a sharp corner, a sharp flange, and it has a beveled flange. That bevel flange plays a big part in how the connecting rod functions properly. The bevel has to face the outboard side of the crank pin. Each crank pin has an outboard side. So, cylinder 1 and 2 reside on crank pin 1. Cylinder 1 is to the most left, the bevel goes to the left. When we put a rod in the number 2, we have to flip it over intentionally to get that bevel facing the outboard side of that crank pin. And then vice versa, and the same thing carries on for 3 and 4. And we'll get into that as we assemble it. So there you have it. There's your pistons in orientation with their intended functions: heat sink, seal, and bushing. We've already talked about how to number the pistons and how to identify the intake and the exhaust side of each piston, intake and exhaust sides. These are numbered: rear banks, piston 1, piston 3, intakes facing the center; front bank, pistons 2, piston 4, intake stamp facing the center. The reason this becomes critical, because over here, we're going to go over here to the crankshaft. This is the crankshaft I'll be using in this engine. Flywheel side. Pin 1, pin 2. Let's talk about pin 1 for a minute. Pin 1, the same as pin 2, has a radius in this corner right here. There's a radius on this outboard side of pin 1. That radius is there for strength. Its typical machining standard is a 5-degree radius. Don't know if that's what Yamaha's using or not, but the radius does exist. It exists right here. It exists right here. As we talk about piston 1, connecting rod 1, it's going to reside in this envelope right here. Then we talk about connecting rod number 2, cylinder 2. It's going to reside in this area right here. So as you can see, for connecting rod 1, the radius is to the left. Connecting rod 2, the radius is to the right. Now we're going to go on to pin 2. Same situation. I got a radius on the outboard side, a radius on the outboard side. Connecting rod 3 resides in this envelope. Radius is to the right, to the left. Come over here to connecting rod number 4. Radius is to the right. That's very critical as we marriage these connecting rods. Typical connecting rod. What we have is a flange with a sharp edge on one side. Flip it over, got the same flange, but now I have a bevel. That bevel is there intentionally in order to swallow that radius without binding. So, if this was connecting rod 1, it must go on with that bevel facing to the left, so that that radius does not create an interference with the connecting rod. And that's what we have there. We have not done any bearing sizing yet, so it doesn't matter which rod I grab, they're all the same. Once I mate a connecting rod to a piston, then that becomes the bearing value for that journal. So, feeling lucky today, I'm just going to grab a rod here. We're going to go with piston number 1. And I'm going to offset these just to show you how they reside in the engine. Piston 1, radius is to the left. I grab my rod, look for my radius, there it is. Got it on the left side. I'm going to put it in the piston just like that. Now I've stepped ahead of you a little bit and put my circlips in on one side of all my pistons so I don't have to deal with the wrist pins dropping out. Piston 2 resides on P1 also, but this time the radius is to the right. Grab a rod, identify my bevel, there it is. I'm going to put it to the right hand side. I'm going to mate this piston to this connecting rod. There we go. Piston number 3, radius is to the left. Grab my rod, there's my bevel, going to the left hand side, drop my wrist pin in. Going to do the same with number 4, but this time the radius is on the right hand side. I'm going to put my bevel on the right hand side. So there's what we have. Pin 1, these are the 2 rods that are going to reside on pin 1. My bevel on number 1 is to the left. My bevel for cylinder number 2 is on the right. Go to the next pin, P2. Piston number 3, bevel to the left. Piston number 4, bevel to the right. Now I did this for the purpose of the demonstration. You're going to want to pre-lubricate the wrist pins inside the small end of the rod just to make sure everything's wet again before starting up. Next thing you're going to see is you're seeing these numbers starting to appear. What we have is each rod has a value. Just like the crankshaft has a value, just like the bores in the block have a value. Well, the bore in this rod has a value installed by Yamaha after they've taken their measurements. You never want to mix up the caps. This cap only belongs to this rod. So when you take your engines apart, do them one at a time, put the cap right back on, pay attention to your bevel side, put it on and hand tighten them down, whatever. Do not mix them up. You'll have big issues. So, I happen to got lucky here with this particular engine as we're going to go into bearing sizing next. This engine, all my rod values happen to be the same. They're all D7s. And I highlighted them for the purpose of the video so that you could see the D7s. And what that's going to do is that's going to become part of our formula for identifying the proper bearing size for P1, P2, and each of the rods. One last note, and we'll go into that. We're going to do bearing calculation, rod bearing calculations next. One last note, circlips. Basically two types of circlips. First of all, when you're redoing an engine, you'll always want to use a new circlip. So the first thing you want to do, if you're using standard parts, Yamaha, you're going to find the end. You want to pay attention to the end of this circlip. Is it a round type, or has it got a flat and looks like a D as we look at the end of the circlip? The typical stock Yamaha VMAX uses a round stock clip. So you can install this clip this way or this way. You get one, maybe you're going to be working with aftermarket pistons or another engine, whatever. You'll find one side is ground flat all the way around one side. It looks like a D on the end. That flat must face the outboard side of the piston. It must set in a ridge, face the outboard side of the piston. I'm not going to install these because I have to lubricate, but I did install one on each piston. The next thing you want to pay attention to, maybe not on that one because I don't have it done yet. How about this one? Here's a good example. This clip is already in. Don't know if you can pick it up or not. Clip is in. It's seated into the ridge all the way around. Then I always like to walk the gap. I never leave the gap at that cavity. I walk the gap around to a 1, 2 o'clock position. There's my gap up there. Two things. Doesn't leave the gap in the opening. Number two, it confirms as you walking it around, it confirms that it's seating into the groove as it should. That's failure you don't want to happen is one of those circlips come loose and start tearing up your cylinder wall, and before you know it, you're taking your engine apart again, probably buying a sleeve. So this is how we marriage, and I'm going to put these back one more time in actual engine orientation, just to be a little redundant with you, but for the purpose of something that's very important. Crank pin 1, my bevel is to the left for cylinder 1, my bevel is to the right for cylinder 2. Crank pin 2, my bevel's to the left for cylinder 3, my bevel's to the right for cylinder 4. And that's with the intake stampings all facing the center of the engine. That is critical. Another thing that's critical, make sure you always use new circlips. I won't torture you and show you how to install those. It's almost as much fun as those valve keepers. Here we are back at our chalkboard. In a previous session, we already did our calculations for our main journal bearings, journal 1, 2, 3, 4. We've already completed our bearing calculation for our balancer journals, 5 and 6. What we're lacking and missing is the rod journals, journals 1, 2, 3, 4, which happen to be the journals bored in the connecting rods. How do we derive at these numbers? Well, first we got to capture some numbers. We're going to go back to the crankshaft. Remember those numbers I talked about that were stamped on the crankshaft? 2 digits, a space, 4 more digits. The first 2 digits are now what we're going to deal with. They represent pin 1 and pin 2 of the crankshaft. I already have my numbers. It was value of 2, value of 2. My journals 1, 2, 3, 4, which we've already calculated, were 1, 3, 3, 2. Connecting rods. We got to capture those numbers. So first, I'll go back over where to locate these 2 numbers. Very simple process again. I'm going to go to the crankshaft. This surface here on the clutch side, 2 digits, space, 4 digits. I doubt the camera can pick that up, but they are stamped. They're easy to locate with the naked eye. I'm going to turn this crankshaft. I'm going to call this the left-hand side flywheel. Journal 1, P1. Journal 2, Journal 3, P2, Journal 4. We are now going to be dealing with P1 and P2. Connecting rods 1 and 2 reside on P1. Connecting rods 3 and 4 reside on P2. Keep that thought as we go forward here. So we have a value for P1 and P2. In a previous session also, we did connecting rod to piston assembly, which now dedicates those connecting rods to those cylinder numbers. As you recall, we labeled our pistons, we identified our in out, we assembled our rod to our piston, recognizing the bevel side of the rod. That's all in that other chapter. So what we're going to do now, I've got cylinder 1 in my hand. I'm going to look for the stamp. It's not on this side. Flip it over. There it is. It's an inked stamp put in by Yamaha after the measurements are done. I highlighted it so for the purpose of the camera. So this cylinder 1 connecting rod happens to have a value of 7. We're going to put a 7 in there. Now, fortunate for me, unfortunate for you, the engine I'm working with, all the connecting rods happen to be a value 7. It's going to be easy for me. Later, we'll do a simulated calculation just to show you a variety of things that can happen. With all rods equaling 7, which they happen to be for this engine, cylinder 1 connecting rod, cylinder 2 connecting rod reside on P1, value of 2. So I'm going to put my 2 in here, my 2 in here. Cylinder 3 and 4 reside on P2, it's a value of 2. As you can see, this is getting easier and easier for me. Because now we're going to do the subtraction just as prescribed for a calculated bearing size. They're all going to be a size 5. So now we have our bearing size for our rod journals. All I got to do over here, finalize my little tracking board here for my order. 5. Things to keep in mind. Main journal bearing has its own set of part numbers. Balancer journal bearing has its own set of part numbers. Rod journal bearings have their own set of part numbers. If you look here, I have a 5, a 5, and a 5. And yes, they're all yellow. But a main journal 5 yellow is a different part number than a balancer journal 5 yellow, and so on, and a rod journal 5 yellow. Make sure when you're ordering your bearings, you recognize the main journal and their part numbers, balancer, and then rod. Now, as I described, we'll try to liven this up a little bit and go with a different set of numbers. So I'm going to get rid of the 7s. I'm going to get rid of the calculations. We're even going to add a little variety here. We're going to say that P2 now equals 1. P1 is a 2, P2 is a 1. I'm going to guess at some numbers here. I'm going to say you're going to see a 6, you're going to see a 7, you're going to see a 5, you're going to see a 4 on your connecting rods. Go through the same exercise. Again, you've already dedicated these rods to these cylinders through your assembly process. Now, here we go again. Hang on. It's been a long day. Okay. So I got a value of 6, a value of 7, a value of 5, a value of 4 at the rods. P1 is a value of 2, cylinder 1, cylinder 2. Put in my 2, put in my 2. Cylinder 3 and 4 reside on P2, it's a value of 1. 1, 1. Try to make that a little clearer for you. 1, 1. And it's just a simple subtraction. 6 minus 2 is 4, 7 minus 2 is 5, 5 minus 1 is 4, 4 minus 1 is 3. How does that pan out on their parts? Connecting rods. Value of 4 is a green. Again, different part number though from the main green. Value of 5 is a yellow. I got another green. And I've got a brown for a number 3. So that gives you a little idea of what you might run across. I just happen to get fortunate in this one engine. So back to this. I have all my sizes, main journal, balancer journal, and now connecting rod journals. I'm ready to place my order, wait on the UPS truck, and I'll get back with you. My UPS truck came in, I hope yours did too. So my bearings are in. Going back to this board one last time. I lied. We'll go back again when we do the rods. But for the main, we're going to install the main bearings and the balancer bearings. Like I told you earlier, the main bearings have their own part number. 1FK11416. I put an XX00. The XX represents the different colors or sizes. For my size 5, the XX equals a 41. For number 3, the 21. 4s are 31s. Balancer shaft, different part number, and you'll recognize that as an old Venture number. They've been continued that bearing into the VMAX for the balancer shaft. 26H 11413 XX00. I got a set of 42s and a set of 22s. Going to the rod ones later. So, coming over to the blocks, I've positioned these blocks this being the upper block, this being the lower block. I positioned them so the journals are matched, and I secured it. You want to do something that's secure so you don't drop your block. Again, left side of the engine, right side of the engine, bike pointing forward. In this case, bike pointing down is forward. Down is forward. Journal, main journal 1, main journal 2, main journal 3, main journal 4, main journal 5, main journal 6, and that's it. The manual calls for motor oil, wetting these with motor oil. That's all I did was wet these surfaces. You don't want to use a real heavy oil because you'll cause the bearing to not seat properly or give you a false reading if you're going to be doing your plastic gauging. So, what we're going to do here is go back to the board, and as you can see, for journal 1, I need a pair of 41s. I happen to have them laid out here. I got my 41. I got my 41. These bearings are not something you want to play with, handle a lot, and so on. So I'm just going to go ahead, open them up. There's one. I'm going to open up the other one. Make sure I don't cut through it. The bearing, once I get it out of the package here, so I'm dealing with set 41, journal 1. The back of the bearing has a protrusion on it. Think you can pick that up? Not sure. That protrusion must go inside the groove, not the oiling groove, but the little notch inside the journal. So I typically like to line it up there, push down, there you have it. Grab my other bearing 41. Journal 1. Again, recognizing the protrusion, the notch. Line it up, right in the notch. Walk the bearing right in. There you have it. Go get our second bearing for journal number 2. Again, it's the same size, size 3. This is where you don't want to make any mistakes. You don't want to overhandle the bearings. And again, just to show it to you, you may or may not pick up that ink spot of brown. Recognizing the protrusion, I'm going to go to the upper block, journal 2, line the protrusion up with the notch, walk the bearing in. I'm going to continue these, and we'll be back with you and show you a set of balancer shaft bearings. We're going to get down to our last set of balancer bearings. We've done all the mains. We'll review that. I've already installed set 42. It's a pair for journal 5, size 5. I'm going to do journal 6, size 3, or fill in the XX with the 22 and there's your entire part number. Same process as the main bearings. These are much smaller. Again, doubt you can see the color, it's there. Much smaller bearing because it is the balancer shaft. So I'm going to journal 6, and again, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. That protrusion's got to line up with the notch in the block. Just walk it down in there. Grab the last half. Going to do the same thing for the lower block. Protrusion to the notch. And just walk it in. And you should be able to roll these a little bit. Now, quick discussion. I'm going to bring out a little pointer. Each bearing has what's called a crush zone. The upper part of this last part of this half radius is slightly less in thickness than the rest of the bearing. Same thing over here. So when your block compresses the other bearing on top of it, it has what's called a crush zone. And it doesn't cause the bearing to squirt out and bind on your shaft. So next, what I do, my practice, you can choose to use it or not. This is just a piece of NHW. It's a very hard plastic. We'll call it a plastic. This has been milled. I've milled all the way around. It's a nice square piece. All I do is lay it over here and make sure those flats are down across the entire block. In case one edge of the bearing is sticking up, This will even it out, square it off. Same thing with the upper block. Again, recognize that your upper block, you got to have it secured. Just again, it's to make sure everything is fully in position. So there you have it. And if you keep this kind of orientation, you'll maintain your relationship of journal 1, 2, 3, 4, journals 5, journal 6. Install the crankshaft and the counterbalance shaft. Remember the days when your mom told you to keep your hands clean? This is the time to keep them clean, because you don't want to contaminate these bearings. I'm going to go ahead, again, dress them with a little bit of engine lube, engine assembly lube. So again, I don't have metal to metal contact. And I'll just start it out like this. We're going to smear this stuff around. Here's one counterbalance shaft bearing, here's the other. And basically you just want to make sure the entire surface of the bearing is wet with your pre-lubricant. I even want to put a little, well, that one came out all right. Again, do this, make sure your hands are clean. Don't let it set a long time. Lubricant is just like a dust magnet. I'm just going to give 2 of these a little more. I got to open it. Nice and wet. Again, we're trying to avoid hard metal to metal contact. One very important thing you need to be aware of. There's a dot. There's a marking. It's a timing mark that works with the counterbalance shaft, as we'll be installing that next. The timing mark on the crank, this is the clutch basket drive gear, drives the clutch basket, or what we will call the right-hand side of the engine, opposite the flywheel. This can be very, very difficult to find. I highlighted in red for the purpose of the movie. So pay attention to that. I'm going to try to keep it approximately straight up and down in the 12, 1, 2, 2 o'clock position. Now, next thing I do, can't install the crankshaft without the cam chains. So I take each cam chain, I wear them like a bracelet. All they do is put them on my wrist like a bracelet. I come over the crankshaft, land them on their appropriate sprockets. I know that I got it. And now I'm going to use these cam chains to help lower or balance and lower the crank into the journals, the main journals. You just want to go nice and easy here. You don't want to nick nothing up. There you go. Just setting in there nice and easy. Now, as I spoke about, we're going to try to get this timing mark in its approximate location to be able to mate it with the with the counterbalance shaft. Another thing about this timing mark, when we get done, this timing mark will land exactly at this flat surface, and so will the timing mark from the counterbalance shaft, putting the crankshaft at top dead center to the block. Not top dead center to cylinder 1, but top dead center to the block. Keyway is a good indication of that. Just as we talked about, a timing mark for a tooth on the crankshaft, we now have to identify the timing mark for the receiving groove on the counterbalance shaft. This is to maintain the timing between the two shafts so the counterweights do work in unison with each other and do not throw the whole balance of the engine off. So in order to install this, I'm going to just take these cam chains, lay them over here. And by the way, while I've done that, just as when we were preparing the upper block, we installed a timing dampener bracket. And I had explained to you there's 2 timing dampeners, but we only installed one bracket. The other one is part of the casting, the lower casting. And there it is right there. Just a point of interest for you there. So here we go. I'm going to take this tooth and put it in that receiving groove, maintain the relationship, and just bring this this counterbalance shaft right into its journals. All things said and done, at the end of the day, top dead center of the block is my keyway. But that top dead center, this crank pin top dead center, both those timing marks should line up exactly on this flat. So it looks like that's where we're at, and we're ready to go forward from there. So we got one last go over here, and we're going to make sure everything's ready to mate the upper and lower block. I told you I had a couple of tricks up my sleeve as far as the cam chains and being able to do this with one person, etc. So I'm just going to take this cam chain, just as you see it. I'm going to pour it. I call it pouring it. I'm going to pour it right down through this opening. I'm just going to let it hand feed, not jam up, if I can get it to do that. Right down that opening. That's one. I'm going to take the other one and do the exact same thing. And as you can see, it's just a very loose lay. Get it to, as I describe it, pour down that opening once I get it back on the sprocket here. So we'll keep, and this allows the chain to hang completely through the lower block. It's hanging approximately a foot to 18 inches below the lower block. You want those out of your way, out of the way of these journal surfaces, just like that. And we're going to deal with them later. Another thing in preparing the block for the mating of the upper, we're going to go back to this shim pack. I'm going to relax that shim pack. I'm going to push this shaft with this screwdriver. I'm just going to take and push this shaft as far to the left as possible. Make sure the shim follows the bearing race, leaving me, there's probably a mil or two additional clearance there for when I bring the top down, I don't crush that shim. Let's see, last but not least, another issue we had, and we talked about it very early on, is this gear. This gear has to come off. This is the time to take it off. I should have never put it on to begin with. Only assemble half of that. Obviously, I already taken my clip off and just taking the gear off to make note of it. Couple of things to go over. My half thrust clips. I'm 50% up, 50% down. Same thing here. 50% up, 50% down. Full thrust plate. Don't worry about it. Make sure all those pins on those bearings are tucked away in their little pockets just like they're supposed to be, in case you've been playing with it or whatever and it rolled up on you. So surfaces are all clean. Any excess pre-engine lubricant that might have come out from you installing your shafts into your bearings, you want to make sure you wipe them away, wipe right up against the bearing, get it all the excess wiped out. Because we're going to put a sealant on this flange. It's a flange sealer by Yamaha, Yamabond number 5. That's the one I use. It seems to work best. So our pins are tucked away, our gear is gone, our surfaces are cleaned. We relax this output shaft to push this bearing as far to the left as possible. We're going to take a walk over to the upper block, and just as we did with the lower block, just confirming a few things. We'd already installed our little oil feed tube. We've got our timing chain dampener bracket installed. Our bearings are pre-lubricated. And everything's been flushed out and all the surfaces have been cleaned. So what I'm going to do next is start applying Yamabond number 5 to the lower block only. I'm sure you had fun with that Yamabond. That stuff is goopy. It works well. It's a good flange sealant. And basically what I've done, and I'll just try to point around, starting here, I'm sealed through here. No reason to seal this. It's internal to the engine. Come out, finish here. Make sure that oil groove guide, that oil passage guide is clear. Start up again here, up to this bearing. From here, around where this is where our clutch slave cylinder will reside. It's exposed. And then up to here. If you notice, and we'll go over here, this is important. This one little area right here is important because it can leak externally, but you don't want to come within 2 to 3 mils of the bearing. This stuff's going to squirt out, it's going to spread, it's going to wet out as we're torquing. So you're trying to keep it away from the bearing or give it a place to go without actually reaching the bearing. I got a little Yamabond around this orifice. This is the one that comes up and feeds the water pump bearing. Let's see, and then again, I'm staying away from my bearing. I start here all the way around, come close to the bearing, not too close, between the bearings, and that's about it. So I told you, had a few tricks here. So what we're going to do, we've confirmed everything. Everything's ready for the mating of the upper block. Again, you want to make sure not only is this fully relaxed to the left, but the shim is all the way to the left against the bearing. The effort's going to be is to hook that block and that shim and then set it down. So here we go. We're going to do that. I like to grab the block by this output shaft housing so I can guide it. And again, my effort is to just keep it. There we go. Keep it plenty of clearance around that shim when you drop it in so you don't crush that shim. So, little cheater thing I do. The next thing is we got to start torquing, putting in our crankshaft bolts, our camshaft, our counterbalance shaft bolts, etc. I use 2 number 6 Allen head screws. I put one right here. I put one right here. Center of the block and back. Effort's not to torque it and tighten it all the way or anything like that. Just make sure it's there. I do the same thing up here. And it's just snug enough to hold the halves together. Because what has to happen next, all your torquing sequence has to start from the bottom. So here we go. Just roll this puppy over. And we're there. One thing I forgot to show you was those cam chains and how we're going to get them out of there. I also have a coat hanger trick I use. But it looks like they're just going to fall out for me. Isn't that nice? And we'll dig those out later. There's no reason to worry about that. This is a little shrewd, but it works. Piece of cardboard. Bottom marking the forward position of the bike. Here we go. The torque sequence, we're going to start with the crankshaft bolts, then to the counterbalance bolts. I'm going to take all crankshaft bolts, get a washer or a washer plate. So this washer plate goes here. I keep all these in order. Call it anal, whatever. It works. Everybody has their own method. Every other crankshaft bolt has to have a washer. I'm just setting these in here because we got to pull them back out. There's a requirement to lubricate them. Washer on every one of them. And where did I go here? I'm going blind. Right there. And again, you can see the washer. The only ones I'm really concerned with at the moment are the crank bolts and the counterbalance bolts. There's one. Here's 2. Here's number 3. Here's number 4. And as you can see, it's just a quick way to keep track of everything. Because when you get into some of these other bolts, as we'll talk about, on the upper case, you've got certain ones with copper gaskets, certain ones without. And I'm going to go ahead and get my torque wrenches set up and get my oil set up, and we'll be right back to you. Just loose laid all my bolts in because they all need to be lubricated with engine oil. That's the trick, engine oil. The crankshaft bolts, we're going to start there first. There's a washer under every bolt, with the exception of these two, because you have a washer plate with a nut plate for securing part of the oiling system, the oil pump system. Another reason I use that little cardboard to keep track of the bolts, these are all different lengths. This pair is one length, as you can see, slightly different. It's intentional. These 4 are longer. But yet these 2 over here are the longest. Counterbalance, all the same. So, I've got my lubricant here. I'm just going to wet the threads down. And drop that puppy in there. Do these real quick. Because we're working with that Yama bond. Even though we got some setup time, we don't have forever. Purpose of the oil. You're running Y oil instead of Loctite. They don't want you to use Loctite here. They also don't want you to create what's called prevailing torque. They want a dynamic torque value without it being false due to resistance within the threads. Well, apparently I started those firmer than I thought I did. All my bolts have been cleaned and all that good stuff. I'm making the assumption you're doing the same thing. That's where it gets a little messy. Not too bad. Again, crankshaft, they all have a washer or a washer plate. Now, we're going to talk about torque real quick. These 10mm bolts have a required 40 Newton meter torque, 29 foot-pounds if you happen to be using a standard torque wrench. The counterbalance shaft bolts, which we haven't oiled yet, so don't let me forget, are 24 Newton meters and 17 foot-pounds. So all I got is all 8 of these bolts are just slightly snug. Again, 40 Newton meters or 29 foot-pounds. Sequence, torque sequence, prescribed by the manual. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Again, I'm not going to try to run all the way to my 40 Newton meters. I'll put a little pressure on it. Try to put an even amount of pressure on it. I think they might even talk about quarter turns, doing quarter turns once you get to this point. Trying to get an equal amount of pressure on it. Going to start over again. A little more pressure. A little more pressure. Making sure my crank moves. Nothing's binding up. We're in good shape here. So here we go. I'm going to try to... There's 40. There's 40. Again. That one was apparently close. Again. Now, I just like to make sure, sounds good, make sure nothing's stretching, joint's not relaxing. They're all holding right at the torque. This makes me happy. So there you have it. Counterbalance journal bolts, and this now is an 8mm bolt. It's 24 Newton meters, 17 foot-pounds. The sequence again to the manual, it's sequence 9. You've already done 1 through 8. Sequence 9, 10, 11, 12. Again, I've flushed them out, so I'm just going to start putting some pressure on it. Try to put some even pressure on it. Draw everything up together. Okay, we're getting there. So we're going to start right here. There's 24. Obviously that one's at 24. There's 24. And there's 24. So there you have it. So, said and done. just gonna switch tools on you here. This is a good time. I've just hand installed my flywheel bolt. It's a good time to just take and feel everything. Is it rolling smooth? Do you feel any? Now my cam chains are hanging down, so you want to make sure you free those cam chains first. I kind of skipped ahead of you. So, and this will only work upside down because of the fact the cam chains with gravity stay out of your way. They won't bind. But as I'm doing this here, I'm going very gently. I'm trying to feel for any binding, any abnormal pressure it takes to rotate it. This crankshaft is rotating. I'm rotating right from the center of the ratchet here. We're using no leverage at all. And that goes back to utilizing the math we did to do bearing calculations for each journal. Take a look at my little bolt board here. Again, I got my arrow pointing this way. What I did is I dropped in and just loose snugged all of the internal bolts here. Again, these are 8mm. Identified a little design flaw, so you're gonna need to do something like this if you happen to use my engine stand setup. Getting the bolts to clear by the 3/4 inch threaded rod was a little bit of an issue. Generally, I put these things together with socket head stainless steel, but these are the stock bolts, and it did give me a little issue, so I had to pry the 3/4 inch out of the way. So these are all loose laid and flushed out, not snug, just flushed out. And like I said, the rear bolts are all loose laid and flushed out, with the exception of this one, and I'll explain that in a minute. So, one thing we got to do before we go any farther and start really compressing this block together, if you remember, we intentionally push this bearing out to the left-hand side of the engine, as I call it, for the purpose of making sure that shim pack was relaxed. You want to set that bearing now before you start compressing the back end of this block. Again, I just use a piece of brass. I'm just going to tap it in there. I'm going to come over here, tap it in. Don't want to beat it up too bad. I'm only hitting the outer race. There we go. These are all 8mm. It's going to be 24 Newton meters or 17 foot-pounds. And we're going to start with bolt 13 here. I'm just going to, again, put some pressure, try to put an even amount of pressure on all the bolts. And this is the pattern. It goes 13 through 17, as prescribed from the manual. A little bit more here. Now I'm going to start going after the torque. 13, here's 14. Here's bolt 15, 16, and 17. And again, I like to go over them just to look for that pulled thread, stretch bolt, relaxed joint, whatever the issue might be. We're doing pretty good here. We haven't ran into anything like that. So now that takes us through bolt 17. We're going to go to the internals. Again, I've dropped them all in. They've all been lubricated. So it's 18 through 22. I've got one outside here on the back side of the stator housing. And again, they're just snugged in. I'm just going to snug them up some more. I'm leaving this bolt loose. We're going to talk about that in just a second. That's intentional. So here we go. 18, 19, 20's left loose intentionally. 21, bolt 22. And if you look really close, you'll find, I don't know if you can read that, you'll find different stampings by these bolts. That's 19, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22. Yamaha was really good about putting this in there. Now we're going to go for torque here. Here's my 24 Newton meter, or 17 foot-pounds. Here's bolt 19, skipping 20, 21, 22. I'm going to check them again. I'm right there. Everything's holding well. So, why did I skip bolt 20? Bolt 20 is an extra long bolt. There's an area up here dedicated for a oil gland. It's part of the oil pump circuit, and you'll see when we install the oil pump, there's a gland that installs on this. If I were to run this down now, it'd just bottom out in the block and it'd still be sitting a ½ inch above the surface of the lower block. So all I'm going to do is throw it in, put a few threads on it. Last of the crankcase bolts for mating the upper and lower crankcase. Again, my little cheater cardboard I used when I disassembled, arrow pointing forward, I called it upper. These bolts are all installed into this cardboard just as they were removed from the engine. 2 bolts you have to be very, very critical of. It's going to be, let me count myself over, 1, 2, 3. It's going to be this one. I'm going to push that back in there, and it's going to be this one. These 2 bolts penetrate an oil galley, and they require copper washers. So you're going to want to make sure you got new copper washers ready. I'm going to start with those 2 only because they're critical. Same process, just going to wet it a little bit. These are 6mm engine oil that's wet. 6mm, require a 12 Newton meters, I think 7 foot-pounds, 7.2 foot-pounds. Just going to keep on going. As you can see, there's a lot of different lengths you're dealing with here. There's a nice, easy way to keep track of everything. Same thing. Now, I'm missing my little clutch bracket. It's a clutch line bracket. I haven't bothered to go through and dig it up. So I'm going to run that bolt in, but I'll be taking it out later. Put that bracket in. So you want to have all your brackets ready too. Don't be unprepared like I am. Here we go. And this also, that bolt's got to come out because this bolt, that was that cheater bolt we used when we first put it together to set up and handle rolling the block over without any main bolts in yet. See how these different lengths are coming up? Every one of them plays a part in this function. So what I'm dealing here with now is I got a couple of 8mm bolts, 4 of them, 2 here, 2 here. Everything else is 6mm, a variety of length, and my copper. Copper, copper. Don't lose track of that. Loose installed all of these, again using motor oil. One thing I want to make note of before we start this torque pattern, over here on the side, your middle gear bearing, main bearing. We already reseated that bearing. Now I'm going to put these retainer plates in. I'm going to go ahead and torque these down now so that any activity on the block isn't going to cause anything to change there. These 4 bolts, they're a Torx bolt. Call for red Loctite. You're going to want to use a red Loctite. And they call for a spec of 25 Newton meters. Who could figure that instead of 24? So I'm just going to put them in. And we're going to want to come back and spade these also. And we'll do that at another time. So I'm going to back my wrench back up to 24 Newton meters because our 8mm bolts require 24 Newton meters. There's 4 of them. The sequence. I'm glancing at the book here. The sequence starts out 1, 2, and then it goes 3, 4, then we're going to go 5, 6, 7, 8, and we're going to work our way around. They go by bolt number. So this is actually bolt 23 in your manual. I'm going to do these 2. These are 24 Newton meter. I'm just going to, again, get them close. I'm going to snug these. Then I'm going to cheat a little bit, and I'll explain that one to you. Oops, didn't want to do that, but that's okay. All right, so here we go. There's 24. There's 24. 24. 24. These 2, I'll be relaxing later because we're going to go through a shimming process for the yoke and final drive. So I'm just going to check them again, make sure nothing's stretched, nothing's broke, no pulled threads, everything's holding torque. I'm going to switch to a 10mm socket. I got to switch down to 12 Newton meters. 4. Here we go. Now, keep in mind a copper bolt, copper bolt. Our next sequence starts right here, as they call it, bolt 27. So we're going to go 27, 28, 29, which is here, 27, 28, 29, we'll go back to them, 27, 28, 29. And you can see their effort here is to, there we go, 12 Newton meters on 27, 12 Newton meters on 28 with copper, and 12 Newton meters there. Make sure they hold, they're holding. Now, I'm going to get this next sequence. So we just did 29, so we're going to jump up to 30, 31, 32, 33. Okay. They're calling this 30. And as you can see, these are actually even marked in here. Here's 31. It's a nice feature. And I got to double check myself on 32 here. 30, 31. 32 is way over here. There it was, right in front of me. So we got 30, 31, 32, 33, and 34, 35. So they're kind of squirting it out this way. So let's go 30, 31, 32, 33, 34, 35. Now, we're going to go back and try to get the torque. That one's in copper. There's 30. 31. 32. 33. 34. 35. One more time. 30. 31, 32, 33, 34, 35. We now have all the critical bolts installed that mates the upper and lower blocks. Back at the bench, just going to show you, give you a demonstration how to install a set of bearings, rod bearings, and a typical connecting rod. So again, you only want to do these one at a time. Purpose being, you don't mix up your caps. Be very gentle. These can jam. It's precision fit, so you can jam them real easy also. My bearings came in. These happen to be size yellow. And again, just like the main bearings, you may or may not be able to see the color. Difference on these bearings, they're not fully grooved or ported like the main bearings or the balancer bearings. But use the same method, try not to overhandle them, and go from there. Has a protrusion, just like the one in the main bearings and counterbalance. So the protrusion goes to the notch. There's the notch. Just going to lay that in there, line up the notch, the protrusion with the notch, walk it in. I'll go into the rod. There's my notch. There's my protrusion. I'm going to lay it in there and walk it in. And again, just like the other ones, you should be able to roll them a little bit. So now what I'll do, paying attention to my bevel side of my cap, I'm going to throw the two together. Just going to start this bolt here, this nut. Just going to crank it down empty, just like we have it here, for the purpose of helping seat the bearing. And I'll just use a little wrench here to, all I'm going to do is just to make sure they're seated, the crush zones are set. Back it right back off because we're going to be taking it apart when we go to assemble it into the crankshaft. So there you have it. Just repeat that 4 times. Again, if your bearing sizes are different, do them one at a time. Go based on your calculation that we did on the board and install them one set at a time, remove one cap at a time, reinstall it. Even if you leave it loose, but keep them reinstalled. You do not want to mix these up. We are ready to start installing our piston rings onto our pistons. First thing you want to verify, of course I tore mine all to hell here. First thing you want to verify is your part number is correct and it is the size you ordered. Because a part number, and then you'll have a digit change for first oversize, second oversize, etc. Make sure the parts counter guy is not asleep on you and he gave you the right rings, ordered you the right rings. So basically, here's what you got. Upper compression ring, lower compression ring, separator, and the 2 oil rings. Separator goes between the 2 oil rings. Very, very critical. This upper compression ring has an R. It's laser dotted onto the top of the ring, on this flat of the ring. You ain't going to pick it up with the camera. I can't even pick it up with the naked eye. I have to look for it with a lit magnifying glass. But there is an R. That R on the upper compression ring must face up to the top of the piston. The second compression ring, this you may be able to see, there's an RN inked into the flat of the ring. That RN must also face up for the second compression ring. The separator can go in upside down, right side up, same with the oil rings. They can go in either way. I also have here is a little inexpensive ring expansion tool for installing the rings. So what I like to start with, I start with the bottom here. Just going to install the separator into the oil ring groove, which is the bottom groove. Make sure it's seated properly. It's not overlapped, etc. The oil rings, I find they're just as easy to install by hand, if not easier than with using the actual ring expansion tool. So there you have it. That one's in. Below the spider. This one's going to go above the spider in the same groove. The separator. You don't want to rake these rings across the lip or edge and scratch your pistons. So those are in place. Now we're going to go with the second compression ring. Again, I'm going to verify that label. There it is. I want it facing up to the top of the piston. This works kind of like a snap ring tool. You don't want to overexpand it or you'll be buying a new ring. All I'm going to do is open this up, walk it down to its appropriate groove, get it close, and I'm almost there. Well, gonna open it up a little bit more. One thing you don't have to worry about on a typical VMAX, the second compression ring will not fit in the groove of the upper compression ring. They're 2 different thicknesses. So there again, it's in its respected groove. I can see my label, it's facing up. I'm going to go now to the last ring. I'm going to verify my label is facing up. My R, maybe it's for a registered trademark, I'm not sure. And again, expand it. Just try to get it close without overdoing it. Get it started in the groove somewhere. And there we go. So all my rings are in place. And I'm going to verify that R. And it's facing up. Now that we have our rings installed on our piston, we've confirmed that the R on the upper compression ring is facing up and the RN located on the second compression ring is facing up. Next thing to do is index the gap of your piston rings. So I'm going to call this forward position of the bike. They're going to ask that upper compression ring. That gap is located here. Think of it as a small X. It's located here. 180 degrees from that is my second compression ring. It's located here. Now I'm going to go to my lower ring set. Upper oil ring is here, and my very bottom is here. So think of it as upper compression ring gap, lower compression ring gap, upper oil ring gap, lower ring oil gap. So this piston, other than lubrication, is ready for installation. So what we're going to do is I'm going to drop the bottom of the rod off real quick. This is going to get a little messy, but you've got to protect the engine, and you've got to protect it, the ring set. First thing I'm going to do, I'm going to use the pre-engine lubricant on the bearings, again to protect them. Nothing goes in dry. Getting it wet, making sure it's plenty good and wet. Next thing we're going to do is lubricate the piston. So once again, I have my magic bottle of oil here, so I don't have to disclose to you what I'm using. I'm going to soak these things down. This is motor oil. You want to do the rings with motor oil. Let it work its way in, get on the flats, get on the sides. You almost can't put too much on here. This will be dripping off of here when I'm done. I'm going to verify my ring position again. Oil will actually help hold it in place. Things are looking good. I'm going to let that set and drain a little bit. We're going to talk about ring compression tool. I happen to like this one. It's a little more expensive. None of them are terribly expensive. It's got the ratchet on it, so that basically when you start tightening it on the piston, you can hear that you get a ratchet effect. It doesn't relax until you release it. So I'm going to open this up. Probably went a little too far there. My inside's clean. Now my band's close to the bottom. That's the side I'm going to have face the block. I also want to lubricate the inside of this. Again, to help with the load, and I don't damage anything. Just going to slip, well, I'm pretty large here. I'm going to close it up a little more. I'm going to slip this over, not even halfway down the piston, but I've covered all of the rings plus some. You can see I'm a little crooked here, so we're going to square it up. And I want to get this as tight as possible without breaking it, of course. That's about it right there. Pretty much a match size, size for size. So we're going to let that set. And we'll go over to the block and prep the cylinder that this is going to be installed in, cylinder 1. Cylinder 1 is the one we're going to install. I've cleaned it out. As you can see, you want to make sure all the debris is gone. So now I'm going to prep it with motor oil, my magic motor oil, matter of fact. And again, be very liberal here. Don't hold back. It's going to drain, it's going to drip. You don't want those rings meeting hard to metal surface. Just going to, and or the piston. So I'm just going to let that sit in there, and we'll go get the piston. Ready to do the installation. And again, just as we talked about, make sure you lubricate with motor oil. The rings have been lubricated with motor oil. Compression tool's on properly. Now as we're talking about cylinder 1. Cylinder 1, crank pin 1. Radius is to the left. My bevel must be to the left. That's the sharp edge. I want to flip it over. There's my bevel edge. So this piston has to go in this way in order to prevent from binding and causing a lot of damage. I'm going to go ahead and take my cap off. Everything's been lubricated really well. So here we go. You just want to let this go in nice and easy. Don't let the rod drag on the cylinder wall. What I like to do, just a hammer, I'm going to use the wooden end, piece of wood, something soft. I'm just going to try to hold that ring compression tight to the block, that compression tool, start tapping this in. And there we go. It's as simple as that. We button up this disconnecting rod to this crank pin. I just wanted to show you, as we talked about bearing fitment and everything else. I'm just going to move that rod over. I don't know if you can pick that up or not, but that's your full floating effect. This rod is moving. It's not loose. It's not bound. And the whole rod's moving. It's moving inside the piston on the wrist pin and on the crank pin. So again, I'm just going to make sure it's over to that side. I'll bring my existing rod right up onto that crank pin. Now I'm not going to try to put the cap on there, but what I am going to do is maintain pressure on the piston. I'm going to roll my engine over, maintaining to where I have good access to both bolts there. And I'm going to tell you, about right there looks pretty good. Now, we go back to our cap. Our cap, again, we want to recognize the sharp edge and the bevel edge. That bevel edge, and by the way, there's a little indicator for it to tell you where it's at. That bevel edge has to face this side. So I'm just going to try to sneak this on here. Not going to force nothing. There you go. Here comes the fun part. Starting these. By the way, these rod studs have been lubricated only with engine oil. You're not to use Loctite on them or anything else. It is, again, just like the crankcase bolts, they're looking for no prevailing torque. So they're to be lubricated only. Something a little different about the rod torque versus everything else we've talked about when we talk about torque. Torque spec is 36 Newton meters. One thing different is they don't want you to walk it up in small increments. They want you to be less than 30 Newton meters and continue from less than 30 Newton meters all the way to 36 without stopping. So we're only going to do a little bit of snugging, and then we're going to go right to torque. So I'm just going to get a little snug there, little snug there. Now I'm going to go for the whole stroke from less than 30 Newton meters all the way to torque of 36. And there you have it. My wrench jumped on me. I'll be going back and checking that. But even if you have to go back, you have to back it up less than 30 Newton meters and then go from less than 30 all the way to 36. We have our lower end assembled, all 4 rods. I'm going to just verify again. I'm going to go in direction of the engine running. Keep in mind I'm upside down. So just looking for that hard spot. You will feel the dwell of the pistons as they reach top dead center or bottom dead center, but other than that, this feels very, very normal. And again, I'm only using a short wrench. If you have to use something a foot long, you need to stop and take a look at what's going on. One last thing. I don't know if you can pick that up or not. I am able to move those rods slightly. So that tells me they're floating. They're floating on those pins. And that looks good. So, real satisfied again with the bearing fit up. We've completed all of our torque specs. One thing I forgot to mention, this bolt right here, it's one of the top bolts. If you recall early on, I'd put a cheater bolt in there to keep the two halves together while we went through our torque sequence. I have gone ahead and taken that one out and put the correct one in. It's torqued to 12 Newton meters just like the rest. What we're going to do now is move on to the clutch housing, see if we can wrap that up here and get it ready for a cover. So next thing to go in, as you can see over here, we have the input shaft bearing retainer plate, the 3 screws associated with it. I've already prepped them with a red Loctite. You want to use a red Loctite. Then once that's installed, we can go back and put in our famous gear that I put in early and had to take back out, and we'll move forward from there. This retainer plate has this little half cut in it, this little half moon cut out of it. That it actually is a guide for that intermediate oil pump shaft assembly. So that basically just fits right up into that groove of that shaft, if I can get it in there. And I'm going to take a screw. First one's always the hardest to start because you're fiddling with all this stuff. I'll grab a second one while I'm here. Maybe. And you just want to loose install them till you get all three, because it is a bevel or a countersunk type screw. And we got our last screw right here. Again, these are prepped with red Loctite, something internal to the engine. You don't want it to come loose. So I basically have that snug. I'm just going to reach in. If you can see the shaft, shaft is spinning, and it is now guided by that plate. So I'm happy with that. I'm going to draw these up. Go back to my Phillips impact driver. Again, this is just something where I try to put a little clockwise pressure on it. And as you're tapping it, you'll feel it rotate. There you have it. So that takes care of our thrust plate, our guide for this intermediate shaft. So I'm going to go ahead and roll that flat to the top, as you can see it. Grab this gear. Again, this gear's got one side flush, one side recess. The recessed side faces out, just like we see it here. I went ahead and got another new snap ring, because again, you don't want to reuse snap rings on something like this. I just take my snap ring pliers, gently expand it, get it on there. Then I like to confirm it's on the gear by holding it, make sure it's seated into that groove, and then leaving the ears opposite or somewhere other than the flat. There you go, that's ready. Here we are, ready to put in our clutch basket. Got our outer basket and our inner hub. A thrust washer, very important here. Our nut locking device in the nut. So, what we'll do, just gonna lube down this shaft, because the outer basket goes in first, and it idles or spins on that shaft freely. So you want to make sure that shaft, just like everything else, is well lubricated. We don't tear nothing up when we start up the bike or the engine. A couple things to remember here, nothing too important, nothing too critical, but we're going to engage in the drive gear, but we also have to engage in this gear. You might have to play around with it a little bit to get it to line up on both gears. So I'm just going to find the first gear, and I'm now on the second gear. And how I can tell that is the shoulder of this bolt, of this shaft, protrudes slightly through the outer basket. Next, I'm going to put a little lubricant on both sides of this thrust washer. It's a precision ground washer. Floats between the inner and outer basket, or the basket and the hub. What I'm going to do is get it nice and wet. It's splined. It's got to fit over these spline teeth here, which it's a precision fit, so it fits over it and goes beyond it. It's going to drop. This is normal. There you go. It just drops and floats. Next, we put on our inner hub. Nothing critical here as far as timing or anything else. Just put it on. There you have it. We have our locking device for the nut. It's splined also. So what you want to do, just put it on, make sure it's on the spline, and sets there. Last piece for this is the nut. Looks like a typical nut. It's not. Hollowed out on the back side. That larger side needs to face or swallow the spline of the input shaft. So it's a fine thread. I'm just going to start it on here. Hands are full of lubricant here, and it'll compress everything. Now that's a 30 mil socket. It's going to require a 30 mil socket and a torque wrench, which I have here. But more importantly, it's going to require a clutch tool. Now Yamaha sells a tool, or if you're like me, I saved some of my old burn-up clutch plates. I used 6 plates. There's 6 pairs of plates here. Made the tool myself. Piece of stock, little stops, and we're going to sneak this on here as soon as we get it to everything to line up. I'm going to embed it into the outer basket also. So there it is, right there. And it just so happens to line up with my threaded 3/4 inch threaded rod off my engine stand. So it's 50 foot-pounds or 70 Newton meters. And I've already preset my wrench. So I'm just going to go, there it is. Give the joint a chance to relax in case it does, but just double check it. And there you have it. That's pretty much it. And of course, getting this off, you're going to have to sneak it off. But it's another way to use those burn-up clutch plates for things other than Frisbees. One more item regarding the clutch basket and the inner hub before we move on is that locking device. I forgot to mention it in the last session. You got to fold that over, get it close to your flat. I've even elected to try to form against this corner. So what I did, I just fold it over to get it started. I'm going to go back to this location here. Again, just a piece of brass, my hammer, and set it down on the nut. Nut's at torque. And I don't know if I'll get at this one or not. I've got one side of it. I doubt might come back later and try to do it with a smaller drift. But you got the idea. Make sure you lock after you set your torque on that nut, that you lock it with that locking device. So, okay, we're ready to start installing our friction discs and steels. What I have over here, it's a new set of discs. They've been soaking. Actually, I let them soak overnight. I think it's some recommendation of about 4 hours. Just allow the oil to impregnate the disc material. And also my steels, I keep them lubricated so they're ready. I like to install stock Yamaha clutch. Will come with a little diaphragm spring, a half disc, a steel, a piece of wire, and then full discs from there out. I like to just put in all full discs, and gives the owner a better clutch, a little longer lasting, and there's no real degradation to any kind of engine braking and anything else that may have been mentioned as to why they put those half discs in there. Here's a typical friction disc. You see, don't know if you can see that. I'll put my finger behind it. See the little waves, 2 little waves, 180 degrees, 1 little wave. Also at the basket, outer basket, 2 dots. 2 dots, 2 waves. We're just going to go ahead and put in a full disc. There you have it. Then we're going to go ahead and the steels. What I notice about the steels, they're stamped. You got a rolled edge or you have a sharp edge. I always put the sharp edge facing the engine, rolled edge out. And that's how we're going to install all of them. Doesn't matter where this goes. There's no type of mark or anything, as long as you can get it on there. And we'll do a couple of these, and then I'll load it up and get back with you. So there goes, here again, wave at the 2 marks at the top. It's in. Here we are. We're going to wrap up our clutch assembly. We're going to install the push rod. There's a ball bearing that has to be installed, and the device that actually pushes against the throwout bearing and spins with it to function for the clutch. So over here, what I have is the push rod, the ball bearing, the throwout device. Don't even know what it's called, don't care. Push rod. we're going to put that in first. There's two ends. One end is flat with a little detent. That's where that ball's going to ride. It's going to function there. The other end is round. It mates up with your piston of your slave cylinder. So the flat with the little dot detent is going to face outward here. I'm just going to slide this in. All of this has been pre-lubricated, by the way. I'm just going to slide it in and let it push right through. The ball. Just a ball, 11-30 seconds. Come to find out, I looked up the size on it. Just going to push it in there. This is all pre-lubricated. There's an O-ring on here also. Because again, as we talked about that oil gland way back in the beginning, it sends oil through this hollow shaft all the way up to this point. Keep everything lubricated and free. Now this, you'll push it in, you'll feel the lip of the O-ring get started. Just let it go all the way in. Not a big deal. Now we're going to go on to the pressure plate. Standard pressure plate. Got a throw-out bearing. Nothing new here. The only thing you got to pay attention to is that dot. Back when we said let's put this dot at the top at 12 o'clock on the inner hub, that dot matches up with this dot in this hole for our installation of the pressure plate. So we're just going to go on there, let it find its way. It did. It's all the way on to the inner hub. Next item is our diaphragm spring seat. That has to go in. If you leave that out, you'll wear out the whole end of this pressure plate from the itching action of the diaphragm spring. Now the diaphragm spring. Here's an interesting device. I typically put them in something like that, keeping two of them centered. It really doesn't matter. I don't think it matters. And we'll just go from there. The bolts, there's 6 bolts. I always recommend that you replace them. These standard bolts are soft. They're not something you want to exchange every time. They don't require a lot of torque. 8 Newton meters, 5.8 foot-pounds. I dress them with a little bit of blue Loctite. Not really called out in the manual. I just can't imagine something with that little bit of torque on it not coming loose. Worries me. So, serviceable Loctite. That's my preference. You can choose to do it or not. Then, what you want to do, just like we've done all the other torque patterns, bring it up, let everything touch. Now that we got them close to being flushed out, I'm going to go ahead and finish this off. And again, it's 8 Newton meters, 5.8 foot-pounds, 5.6, 5.8, something like that. And you'll feel these bottom out. It's a very light setting, so you got to be careful that you don't overdo it here. Okay, so now I'm bottomed out. I'm going to start right here. Don't know if you can hear that. That's that wrench clicking. Just going to check them all again, and then we'll have this wrapped up. So there you have it. This clutch housing is complete, and it's ready for the cover. Okay, it's time to start buttoning this thing up on this side. So first thing you want to verify is your dowel pins are in. There's 2, one here, one over here. We're upside down, so that helps confuse you. The other thing I do, typical Yamaha gasket doesn't require any sealant. They have little added areas that are heat activated once the engine's warmed up. I consider the clutch a serviceable cover. I grease the gasket. Actually grease the gasket both sides. It's an old trick, just because it may require service for changing clutches, etc. So, just put the gasket on. It's lightly greased on both sides. I'm going to go ahead and put my clutch cover on. Gonna land it on the dowels first. Walk it on. Let the dowels hold it. Now, I prep, again it's my preference, you don't have to do it. I prep the bolts with a little bit of blue Loctite. There is 2 long bolts and the rest, the other 7, are standard size. The 2 long ones happen to go where the dowel pins are. So I'm going to put those in now so I don't confuse myself later. Here's my other long one. It's going to go in my other dowel pin hole. So what I'll do, I'll install the rest of these, flush it out, and I'll be right back with you. Okay, here we are. Got everything flushed out, getting ready to torque it. They're all 6mm. Again, you have 2 bolts that are different than the rest. It's the 2 that have the dowel pins. They're longer than the rest of the bolts. So it's 10 Newton meters, and I'm just going to use a little crisscross pattern here, starting at the bottom of the engine, which I have upside down. So I'm just going to pull it in a little bit, kind of something like this. Get everything close. As soon as I'm going to land on that thing. Alright, here we go. There's 1. There's 2. 3. 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. I think I left one out. It's probably this one. Here's number 9. Now I'm just going to verify. I'm just going to run around the pattern, make sure everything's holding, just to have it. And this should wrap it up for our clutch. And again, I like to grease that gasket. I know sooner or later somebody's going to be back in there putting in a clutch. And this allows you to reuse the gasket. You might even get a couple cycles out of the gasket before you have to replace it. Here we are, back to some bench work. I'm going to rebuild a water pump here. The items needed to rebuild water pumps: a new ceramic seal, new mechanical seal, a new oil seal, and a new bearing. All the other components are going to get reused. The impeller is going to get reused. The drive gear is going to get reused. The pin. I also have 2 new 10mm snap rings. So, tools needed aren't much. What I like to do, call it shrewd. I use my old 16-point sockets, which I find not too much other use for. I have one that matches the diameter of the bearing for the outer race only, one that matches the seal, and one that matches the mechanical seal. So what I'm going to do here first is just lube up this one little area. We're going to set the bearing, and then we're going to set the oil seal. And you'll see this all goes together relatively quickly if things go well here. So I'm going to put the bearing in there. Try not to cock it. Try not to get it bound. I also use an old extension. I'm sure we've all got them. And it's going in. It's time for a arbor press. You want that bearing flush. Almost there. It'll bottom out. Okay, looks to be bottomed out. Flipped over. Just going to wet my oil seal down. typical oil seal. The spring or lip, and we'll try to view it here, goes to the inside. That's the lip side. I don't know if you can see that spring in there. So that's going to go down for the position we have right now. And this is what separates the oil from the water, as we talk about. I'm just going to make sure it's seated. There you have it. Next is the mechanical seal. It's got some type of banding sealant on here. I am going to lubricate it a little bit though. Just something I like to do. It's also a press fit, obviously not as tight as that bearing. You want to make sure that lip is down. You can hear it get solid all the way around. Now this works as a mechanical seal, as you can see, spring loaded. While we're here, I'm going to wet the face of that just to get some lubricant in there for when we get started here. Next, the ceramic seal. Ceramic seal goes into the impeller. Going to wet it down again, the back side and the front side, the perimeter and the front side. Give it time to break in. And then this just goes the white or the ceramic facing straight up. You just push it in just like that. Not bad so far. Now for the fun part. Typical, just goes right through the bearing. You're going to push it in. You can see how that mechanical seal pushes back. That's what keeps the water out of the oil. The one seal keeps the oil out of the water. This keeps the water out of the oil. I'll get set up and we'll go from there. Next thing we got to do is load our 10mm snap rings. Always use new ones. There's two grooves. There's a groove here that's going to set the depth of the gear, and then this groove retains the bearing. So effort's going to be is to open it up without overstretching it, walk it down, get past that first one. Now I'm going to compress down on my shaft assembly and grab that second groove. We're going to try to confirm it here. Just by spinning it. Alright, that looks seated. I'm going to double check it under my magnifying light. Yes, I'm well in the groove. Next thing, little drive pin. There's a little cross bore in this shaft. Put the drive pin through it. 50, equal both sides. This gear can go on either way. It's flush on both sides. No one side shouldered greater than the other. I'm down on my drive gear. Our last clip. And as soon as I get this loaded, again, another brand new 10mm snap ring. It's going to open it up enough to slide it. And as you can see, I'm in that groove. Next thing you want to make sure is you spin it. Everything's new, but to make sure depth is correct and everything else is correct, you're not actually got a hard wipe or a grind on that impeller to that housing. And as you can see, that's spinning very freely and ready to go. Well, here we are, getting ready to install the water pump we just rebuilt. A couple of things to pay attention to. It's got two dowel pins right here and here. This shaft bore, it's for the water pump shaft itself. I've pre-lubricated again with some engine and assembly lube. So all I'm going to do is take the pump housing that's finished, locate it on these dowels. But what gets a little critical here is you want to make sure you clock your gear so that it mates with that drive gear coming off the counterbalance shaft. And it's as simple as that. So with the last cover to the water pump, I like to lubricate, just as you can see, put some more of that engine assembly lube in that groove. I've pre-lubricated my new O-ring. O-rings like petroleum, helps them live longer. They're a rubber base and petroleum base. So there you have it. So you want to make sure you got that ready to go, and we're now ready to continue installing the water pump. Now we're back at our water pump. We've already installed the first half of the housing, and again paying attention to clocking that gear so it mates with the counterbalance shaft. We've got our final cover here with the new O-ring in it. It's lubricated, and what you want to pay attention to, this machined area here lines up with this machined area down here. If you get it wrong, your bolt pattern will not line up. So what we're going to do is I'm just going to hand install a few of these, help hold everything together, and then we'll get into the bolt placement. Two of these bolts are intentionally short for the purpose of holding that cover on, and I'm just going to start them now so I'm not having to fiddle with this. There we go. Not going to tighten them, just going to make sure they're started. Now, the rest of this cover, 1, 2, 3, receives the longest bolts. So they go through the cover, through the water pump housing, directly to the block. I'm just going to throw them in. Again, just lightly snugging them to the surface. You can see it's drawing everything up. The remaining bolts are all the same length. Just going to hand start them all. Then we'll flush them out and get back. Just going to go forward with the torque pattern for the water pump. All 6mm bolts, 10 Newton meters. I'm going to start here. I'm just going to use a triangular pattern. I've flushed everything out, so I'm just going to go right to torque here. There's 1, 2, 3. Now I'm going to 1, 2, and as you can see, I'm ignoring these 2 bolts because they don't go through the case. They only go through to secure this cover to here. We'll get those last. So we're there. I'm going to go ahead and check them. There's 1. By the way, I had to take my drain plug out, get clearance for the socket. Walking around here. We're there. I'm going to come back and pick up these 2. Just going to throw my drain plug in. Got a new copper on it. So actually it's a new drain plug. Put it in. I'll snug it for now. I'll have to go back and get the torque setting on it. And there you go. This whole side of the engine's done. Water pump's installed, clutch covers installed, and we can move on to the other side.